So again, the last session gave me a really nice, timely segue in that stories about the Ukraine are in the top 10 of stories most of greatest interest to Canadians. And so this panel is all about covering Ukraine, a story that is thousands of miles away but feels very close to home for a lot of Canadians. So today we hear from three people who have been covering the story from the studio but also from Ground Zero. Lisa LaFlamme, Chief Anchor and Senior Editor of CTV News. We have CBC National News Anchor and Senior Correspondent Adrienne Arsenault and Senior Correspondent for Global News Jeff Semple. Moderated by CBC host of Sunday Magazine, Piya Chattopadhyay. So welcome. And first, but before we start, let's have a look at some of the stories that they've been able to tell us and bring that conflict home.
Not the first time in this war, air raid sirens pierce the still of Lviv's nights. No one will be here for long. Off a bus from the east for just a few hours to regroup safely. This is Valentina, and let's leave it at Valentina because she's worried. That video taken moments after the Chernobyl nuclear plant was invaded by Russian troops in February. Its workers held hostage inside, including, she says, her dad. A family from Kyiv staying here while 12-year-old Anna undergoes treatment. A young model and dancer with big dreams.
I see your beautiful eyes in here. Very nice.
Thank you.
These little two, that's Oscar and Arthur, their families from Kyiv. They've moved to Lviv, and their parents have brought them down here in part to something to do and to just keep them playing.
They know all these places and they're not scary. Yeah. They understand what the air attack is.
So this is a look inside. They say it's similar in many ways, but it's a newer model and it's much faster. So they have to learn how to handle it. They say this thing can go up to 100 kilometers an hour. In fact, they've nicknamed it the flying tank.
One of the key pretexts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine was to protect Russian-speaking communities like this one. Well, this is what Vladimir Putin's protection looks like. This was an apartment building that was shelled just recently, and as you can see, that rubble is still everywhere. The battle for Kyiv isn't over yet. Volunteers have been digging these trenches by hand in various locations right across the capital to help them fortify their positions and push the Russians back.
A war crime is any instance where civilians are deliberately targeted. For example, this apartment building blown apart by 2 bombs allegedly dropped by a Russian warplane. 9 people were killed, and this is now being investigated as a possible war crime.
There are a lot of military cemeteries in Europe full of soldiers, including Canadians who served during the First and Second World War, but it is rare to see a military cemetery with graves so freshly dug as this one. All of these soldiers have just been buried here. They were killed in the fighting over the past month.
Tonight, from the battlefield to the border, the devastating reality as Russian rockets unleash over Ukraine. Were you frightened? The air raid sirens were wailing, Yulia says. So this was the hardest decision of your life.
It is. It is. Please help. Stop the war.
At any given moment, giving in seems the only safe bet.
Oh, what does that say?
It says, do not be afraid.
Be not afraid at a time when fear is in charge.
Do you think the Ukrainian army can beat Russia?
No.
What does patriotism mean to you?
It's about love to my country, not to my government.
For 700 orphans from Odessa, Kate is 13.
Are you scared?
No.
Do you believe that Russia will use nuclear weapons?
I hope not. I don't think so.
How is Daria holding up?
First days I was crying.
We won't look away. Ukrainians are not alone.
I
Hi, everyone. Hoping you can all see over there. Okay. Hi, I'm Piya. So we were just kind of backstage just talking, and Adrienne and Lisa started talking about the last time, a memory that when they were out in the field together back in 2004 in Sri Lanka, and I said, don't tell that story because I'm going to tell this story. Anyway, the three of us were all there after the South Asian tsunami, and there was probably like 12 of us from different media organizations getting on a crappy little plane, and I'm not a great flyer. I'm really nervous, and when I got on there, I remember thinking, damn, if we go down, Lisa LaFlamme and Adrienne get billing, and I get, and others died in the plane crash. So that is why I became a host. It's not. But it was a long time ago, and I was well on my way into the business, but seeing these two in action back then was inspirational, and I don't use that in kind of a cliche, gross way. It was really amazing to see you back then, and seeing what you've done all these years, and Jeff, who I said had come along a little bit after us. Sometimes when we get older, we look to the people that are newer or younger, and sometimes when I watch you, I wish I just had a do-over as a reporter. You guys are really amazing, so thank you. Just by way of telling you all, we're going to talk about the last 3 months. We're going to be talking about stories, which is the bread and butter of what journalists do, and I know we talk about a lot of high-level things and all those things, and they're important, but without storytelling, none of it really does matter. Adrienne and Lisa just got back from the Queen's Jubilee on Monday, and Jeff just got back from his second tour in Ukraine on Tuesday. So
we may fall asleep at any moment.
So the other thing I just want to tell you all is we will leave time at the end for Q&A, but I feel it's better if we're talking about something and you have a question that is relevant to that point of discussion. Please just stand up. We'll get a mic too, and we'll just do it that way. I want this to be as free-flowing and as much for you and with you as it is with these three. So let's just start with, because just to give people the lay of the land, in the last 3 months, since February 24th, so where have you been in the region? And I want you to tell me, you've all covered a lot of conflicts. They all have some similarities. They're all a little bit different. What sort of your biggest takeaway is, and something like you haven't said on air, right? So give us a little insight what your biggest takeaway is.
Wow, my biggest takeaway, I would need a lot more time than 49 minutes left. But I think, first of all, we'll never forget that Wednesday night when Kyiv was hit for the first time, and just that sinking feeling, knowing this is what we've all talked about for so long, a Russian attack, certainly since Crimea, knowing it was in the wind. And immediately it's the question of deployment. How do we get there fast? Where do we go? How do we get in? How do we cover this story the best? My biggest takeaway, though, is really the overwhelmingness of the international community on this specific war. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. That includes NATO nations, because nobody would go in. So therefore, heavy equipment, heavy weapons, doing the heavy lifting for the Ukrainian forces. And also, my takeaway is the incredible resistance. We now know there are 4 Ys in Volodymyr Zelensky, and we also know this guy, I wouldn't want to screw with him. I mean, he is honestly overwhelming the resistance that's been built, and I think it's shocked Putin as well.
I will just say there's 3 Ys in Piya Chattopadhyay, so I don't know.
I know, I totally knew that.
And Lisa, just so people know, where were you in the region, and tell us the kind of stories you were telling.
Oh, okay, so we left on like 2 days later, and we went to Poland, because one of my challenges is doing the whole show. We didn't know, was there going to be connectivity? And the worst thing in the world, as I'm sure you guys would agree, is you get somewhere and there's no way to get your stories out. And it was all happening so fast, and there wasn't a big international footprint yet. So we ended up staying in Poland. We were at the border. We were in Krakow. We were in Warsaw for, the sort of geopolitical side of it. And so I stayed in Poland throughout my work. But we had whole teams in Ukraine, in Latvia, in the UK, all over the place, really, to try to feed the many levels of this story.
Adrienne, where were you, and what was sort of your big takeaway in terms of, you covered a lot of different kinds of stories and a lot of conflicts over the years, but what stands out for you?
Well, I was doing my laundry after Beijing. because I'd been there for the Olympics, where we talked about Ukraine all the time, where we talked about what's going to happen with Russia. And when you had those conversations, you know, excuse me, Mr. Pound, hi, I know we're here to talk about the Olympics, but have you had a chance to talk with Vladimir Putin? You didn't get a lot of traction on that, right? So we didn't get a lot of pickup. People weren't interested. I'm not talking about bosses, I'm talking about at the Olympics. You'd get a lot of hairy eyeballs from people asking that question, but it was coming. You could feel it coming. We knew it was coming, and Vladimir Putin is a man of ritual, and one of his rituals is to invade after the Olympics. So we knew this was coming, and so, as you said, the timeline is bang on. As soon as that happened, and we went in, and yes, we had the deployment conversation as well. And so we went to Poland right away, and then had to figure out, as you did, Lisa, how to do the program. And so for us it meant, well, let's give it a shot. What could possibly go wrong? There's another host, you know, so that's okay if Adrienne doesn't get in, because Andrew's there, right? Which was true, thank God for that. So we went into Lviv, crossed the border on foot, grabbed our stuff, went in, and then just tried to figure out how to get the stories out. Weren't in there for very long. I mean, this gentleman, who's a colleague of both of ours, watches stories. Chernobyl, last couple weeks, he'll tell you all about them. But, you know, Lisa and I both would like to be able to slide into that role more frequently. But I got some great opportunities. And what struck me, so many things. Right away, the sense of, are we going to be able to communicate how big a deal this is, how fast this is, that this refugee crisis in particular, how are we going to be able to communicate effectively that this is a nuclear event that looms at us? So the implications were huge, but also the sense of service on the part of the Ukrainians we met really struck me. I have never been somewhere where people came up and said, can we help you? And we say, oh no, it's okay, thanks very much. No, this is our duty to help you. And there were people, would you like a drive? Do you need somewhere to stay? We're like, no, our ethos when we go on assignment is, you know, cause no more burden to the people you're covering. Don't take anything from them. And yet people were overwhelmingly trying to say, this is what we can do, is to help you communicate. So I've never encountered that it's so forcefully before, and I think it's still happening.
Okay, Jeff, so you've been in twice, you've been to many places in Ukraine, so maybe a couple of takeaways, and just what it's like, as Adrienne said, like Lisa and I are there and they're getting the field, but not as deep and as far as you are. So what is it like covering this really up close?
Yeah, I mean, it's as Lisa said, it's a tough answer to put into 2 minutes, but I think technically we're supposed to be good at that. But I think, I mean, we covered a lot of ground, sort of east, north, south, west, and I think, you know, it was interesting, the change from, so we were there the first time sort of March, April, and then the second time May, June, and just got back this week. And it's almost like a tale of two countries now. Like, it's at the risk of oversimplifying it a little bit. Like in the West, it is just so much more relaxed than it was the first time we were there, where there was this sort of ominous sense that the Russians were coming for this whole country. And now, since they've, of course, declared that the Donbass is their focus and yada, yada. But in Kyiv, when we were there the first time, it was like a ghost town, and, you know, it was like, where are we going to find food to eat here, right? And this time it was like, we can't get a seat at a table in a restaurant. Like, the city has roared back to life. People are sipping lattes and craft beer, and I mean, when I was there, it hadn't been hit in a month, and it was hit the day after we left, so of course it's still under threat. I mean, everywhere in the country can be hit, but, and then, you know, you drive, you know, it's a decent 800-900 kilometer drive from Kyiv to the Donbass, which is sort of roughly Calgary, Vancouver, so it's far, but not that far, and it's just a horrific war zone, and civilian targets are being obliterated every single day. And I think I was struck also just by, like, we spent a lot of time in these Russian-speaking communities that Vladimir Putin is coming to liberate, right, from the genocide. And maybe I expected to find more Russian speakers, especially like in Kharkiv, it's 40 kilometers from the Russian border. It's like a Canada-US border town, right? Like people have relatives on both sides. There's a close affinity with Russia there. And so I thought, you know, it's not unusual, I think, even in Canada to find people from, you know, old Soviet countries and diaspora who have sort of a nuanced opinion of this war. They think it's sort of complicated, and yes, Russia's bad, but it's a little more complicated than that. We didn't meet a single Russian-speaking person in 2 months in Ukraine who had anything but pure disdain and this feeling of betrayal. Many of them have relatives just north of the border who have now they've lost their, you know, their families torn apart. And so to meet ordinary Ukrainians who are, you know, Russian-speaking, who felt these extremely close ties to Russia, who are now learning to use a Kalashnikov for the first time to kill Russians. Including one guy in particular who, I mean, you know, we always try and separate ourselves as best we can from these stories, but there was a guy who had I have a 2-year-old, and he had a 2-year-old and a wife, and we were about the same age, and they refused. I mean, the men had to stay, right, fighting aid men, but the women and children were leaving on the train. There were these heartbreaking scenes over and over again, right, as we've seen on play out many times. But this guy's wife refused to leave him, like just refused. And so she was staying, their daughter was staying, and so he was learning to use this Kalashnikov. And it was just the defiance that Adrienne talked about. I mean, I think, you know, you see cover conflicts in various parts of the world, but I've never seen anything like the defiance of the Ukrainian people. It's just incredible. And it's exactly what, you know, the stories that we've done, you know, barely scratch the surface of that, I think.
So let's talk about where we are, because we're 100 and some days into this, and I don't mean to be trite about this, but this conflict seems to be somewhat frozen, and by which I mean it's going to drag on, and we know audiences might not have the same attention span or desire. Maybe our organizations won't want to cover it in the same way. So I'm wondering how you, and I know you're all involved in the leadership of your shows in different ways and pushing to get out there again. How do you keep this story going?
I would say, I mean, for me, it's just so hard when there isn't a story, because that is exactly what Vladimir Putin wants, is for the rest of the world to get bored, look at their viewership, get a sense. Of course, we all know there's a fatigue out there, but that doesn't lessen the impact of what's happening. So I think we just have to keep telling these stories. And, you know, one of the most important things for all of us is to not get mired in this concept of, well, you know, there's this sense that we've got only bad news. This is happening right now, and I think more than anything, we just have to keep fighting to keep telling the story. It matters deeply, and sometimes it is a fight. Well, is there really, like even this morning I said, well, can we do a full up? I was hearing all about these new elements. Well, the elements are thin. That's the answer you get back. Why? Because there aren't actually as many agencies, or reporters aren't able to get around as much. It's a lot more dangerous right now, because like if you look at a city like Kherson, you know, it's occupied city now. So it's really dangerous for journalists to be in these places, because the Russians don't care. You can have press on your flak jacket. They literally don't care. So there's all of these things happening, and it's the decision every desk makes. Who do we send? Where do we send them? And how many times? Like when a reporter is in, we literally get a file out of them every single day, because they are compelled. You are compelled to keep telling the story when you're on the ground there.
And you're involved at CTV in deployment and sending people out, yeah?
We're involved in the discussion of who's going, when are they going, how long are they staying, and I think that, and I know Rosa Wang is also here, I don't think either of us have slept in 107 days, because it's really hard to sleep when you have a colleague and an old friend, usually, who's in a war zone, and you hear about a rocket, and I can't tell you how many times I've called Paul Workman and said, I just need to hear your voice. Just, you know, tell me you're okay. So it's, you know, it's the commitment of people like Jeff and others who are in there for the long haul, you know.
And so Jeff, pick up on that, because again, we're like 100 and some days in. I don't know, maybe the fatigue is there, maybe it's not. But like, how are you sort of energizing yourself to keep telling the story and not telling, quote unquote, the same story?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think, and when we were on the first trip there, it was just like breaking news, like as many stories as you could, as fast as you could do them. And like often they didn't even have a clear focus. It was just dog's breakfast of different stuff. This time we were sort of talking about, because to address that, to reduce the frequency a little bit, but focus on the higher impact original stories as a means of trying to keep people engaged and to avoid the fatigue. So we did fewer stories, but I think some of them did better than in terms of the uptick in the attention and all of that. So we did like original features more, and it was less sort of covering the news and more just looking for those stories, which of course take a bit of time. So, to our leadership's credit, they sort of signed up for that. It was like, yeah, you don't have to file every day, maybe every 2 or 3 days. And so we found like this group of foreign volunteers who called themselves the Wolverines, who were, training Ukrainians and had been, tagging Russian tanks with the Wolverines calling card, which was a reference to Red Dawn, one of the worst, most violent movies of all time. Although some people may disagree. And we did one the other day about this 15-year-old drone pilot who helped to identify a column of Russian tanks that were heading for his town. There was no drone operator in his town, and they knew the Russians were coming early on. They lived just north of Kyiv, and the forces, were in touch with this kid, basically found out he had the drone. He goes out into a field with his dad, puts his drone up into the sky, and he spotted the Russians coming. And his dad relayed the photos and the coordinates to the military, and they wiped out the Russian column before they reached his town. So these were sort of different stories that we hadn't heard before, and that story, I think, on YouTube was like 1 million views in 24 hours, which is not my usual batting average for Stevie. So yeah, I think it was, and I mean, there's lots of questions raised by that story, which you can help to unpack in our online story. But I think that was generally how we tried to do it, is to say, okay, what are the original stories that will be, even though it's, and it's just, the bottom line is it's just keeping people's attention on this conflict, because as Lisa said, that's inevitably going to wane a bit. Yeah.
So Adrienne, when you're in your meetings, because of course someone at that table is saying, oh, well, Canadians care about, cost of gas and higher food prices and those things, and oh gosh, what is your argument? Like, what are you saying at that table to keep this story going?
Well, I think what we all should be saying is, yeah, you want to know why their gas prices are high? Yeah. You want to know why Sri Lanka's having an economic crisis? You want to know why wheat's in trouble? Guess what? Let's go back to Ukraine. And I think that's where we have as storytellers an obligation to build the connective tissue to help people understand that, you can have a newscast where you say, okay, here's our Ukraine story, and now we're going to talk about COVID, now we're going to do something else. Let's do an international whip. And we're going to talk maybe about unrest in Bangladesh and unrest in Sri Lanka. No, bring those right back up to the top, because those don't belong a block away. They belong right beside Ukraine. And connected to that needs to be a story from someone saying, why does X lead to Y? Here's why. And that's how you help people connect. If people are telling us now, I don't get it, or if they're saying, I don't feel it, that's our fault. That is on us. That is not on them. So I think that, firstly, we have not, you said it at the end of your cast, and I know you mean it. We're all competitors, but we are all fierce colleagues here. Like we know each other's work, and we have enormous respect. And when you said you won't take your eyes off it, we don't. Margaret Evans is in there right now, in the thick of it, as only Margaret Evans can do. And we're not letting our eyes off. We've had a bureau in Russia for 40 years, and we have an extraordinary producer who's there right now cleaning up 40 years worth of incredible journalism because Vladimir Putin said, get out. Well, okay, we'll get out, but don't think we're taking our eyes off. We will find a way to wiggle back in there. So I think it's, as Jeff said, it's quality, not quantity. It is connective tissue, and it is bloody persistence.
So let's talk about that, because, in other conflicts, obviously most recently in terms of Canadian involvement militarily, Afghanistan, stuff, like we all had access. You had access to the front line. You had access to both sides or many sides, and we don't in this one. So in terms of how you tell a story when we're cut off, and we have a large Ukrainian diaspora here, more Ukrainians coming, lots of pressure. I mean, lots of pressure to tell this story from all sides. But how do you tell the Russian side. Whether you agree with it or not, we're journalists, and there are two sides to this. So how are you thinking about that these days, especially, and I'll start with you, Adrienne, because we're no longer in Russia. I mean, none of us are. I don't know when we'll get back in.
We're Russia adjacent. We like
Sure,
to say.
okay. Yeah, so how are you thinking about that? Like when you, because you sit there and say, you talk about balance, you talk about like we do have to do that, and how are you thinking about that?
So I think a couple ways. Safety is really important. You know, when we reach out to people in Russia, we don't want that connection to get them killed. And you know, Lisa talks about staying up late at night. These are things we think about too. We all have sources and people we connect with who we worry about, that the act of them being generous with us is going to cost them. So this is a consideration for all of our news organizations. But we have, like Briar Stewart, who was our most recent correspondent in Russia, is, I don't think I'm telling tales out of school, is going to stay focused on Russia. We still have connections in there. We still have, you know, we still have ways of getting information out there, but it is work. Like, it is work. The stories might not come as quickly, but boy, they are good, and they will continue to be good. But it is work. None of this is low-hanging fruit, and we're at the stage of this conflict where nothing is really grabbable. So it's just work. You just have to work it.
I remember one morning, it was a Saturday morning, walking through a square near the border, and there was one girl there all alone, and she had this poster that said, I am a Russian, I am against war. And you talk about how do you tell those stories. And I just walked over to her. I didn't have a camera or anything, and we just started talking. Of course, she had impeccable English. And she was so emotional, telling me how she can't even speak to her mother anymore. She can't speak to her sisters. They're still in Russia. They still believe in Vladimir Putin and what's happening. They believe the misinformation and the lies they're hearing. And so one of the ways I felt I could try to tell those stories was through the Russian expats, certainly in Poland, in this country. But it was the same as Adrienne said. They didn't want to be their faces on. We did a FaceTime, one young woman with her mother, and we had to be very careful about blurring it because the last thing we want is to put anyone at risk. But it was very emotional, as all of these stories inevitably are. When you're not covering the ballistics of something, you're covering the heart of it. But just speaking to these Russians who, you know, they're like the rest of us, you know, gobsmacked that this is actually happening, and it's their families that have been torn apart. So just trying to tackle it some ways like that it's a challenge, though.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo the point that it is, I mean, obviously so challenging when offices are being closed, but also, I mean, when I was based in London for about 6 years, did tons of stories on Russia, and, you know, you build up a nice Rolodex of people there, and none of them will talk now, the ones who are still in the country. They either won't talk, I mean, most of them just say flat out no, because it's just not worth 15 years in prison for them, right? I mean, it is a scary, chilling moment. I think, you know, I know some fixers and producers there that we've been working with to try and carefully gather us voices from inside there. I do have my poor mother is probably watching this stream, but I do have a Russian visa application that has been pending for about 3 months now. I'm not holding my breath, but I think, yeah, it is extremely challenging, and I think, you know, as Lisa noted, the diaspora is, you know, one of the best ways to get at it. There's lots of people who have fled the country. You know, we were chasing people in Georgia and Armenia, and but I think it is the biggest challenge right now in terms of trying to get at that part of the story, because the people who are there are just absolutely terrified to talk.
If you have questions, stand up. If not, okay. Is someone standing? No one standing? What kind of journalist? Come on. Oh, great.
Is that the talking box he's holding there?
Yes.
What is that?
Wow.
Yes, I got the talking box. That's great.
Can you just tell us who you are?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So my name is Madison Fitzpatrick. I'm a reporter for City News 680 and a producer for Rogers TV. So one of the questions that you posed was, how do we keep the story of Ukraine relevant in our time, in our news? What makes it important to Canadians? But my question is also on the stories that aren't necessarily war-related, let's say, obviously, for example, the mass shootings that happened recently in Texas, and what about, natural disasters or any big events that happen around the world? How do we keep those relevant? Because obviously through this pandemic, it's been so long where people say, oh my God, that was 2 years ago? Oh gosh, that seems like, so long ago. But how do we keep those stories relevant?
You ask a really good question, Madison, and I think it's something that rattles around for all of us every day. And I go back to this notion, I feel really hard on this, I go back to this notion is if the story doesn't feel relevant to you at the end of the day, that's on us, right? So that's good storytelling, right? Is to explain why you, Madison, really need to watch well, so you do anyway, really. But you really need to watch tonight in particular, and we're going to help you with the connective tissue. What Jeff does in a lot of his stand-ups and what you did there about the war crimes and the war cemeteries, that kind of context, like you've always been really good at that, but that kind of context is really important. That's not just like, here are some soldiers buried here. Here's what you need to know. There are war graves all over Europe. They're not often this fresh. That kind of storytelling, I think really, really can help people. It's our job to reach through whatever screen we're punching through, little or big or 75-inch, whatever it is, and help make that connection for you. So how do we do it? We get better at doing it, because if anybody is questioning the relevance of what they're seeing, we're failing, I would say.
Okay, but let me put this to you just to follow up. So Megan, is that your name?
Madison.
Madison, pardon me. Madison said, but like, how do you keep the mass shooting on? And I know, because I'm involved in them too at my show, and we all are. Someone's like, oh, another mass shooting, there's one every day in the US. So I think the question is, maybe how do you go beyond the headlines and make those stories, the more contextual stories? You have half an hour a night. You have different choices than Adrienne and her team have because they have longer time. But how do you make the case for this matters? And I think you might be asking more about our internal decision-making rather than the audience. Am I right on that? Yeah. Okay. So how do you say, like, listen, peeps?
It is in the writing. It's the writing, it's the context. A mass shooting, certainly it's true. America is in a state of crisis over its mass shootings, and this one, as devastating as the others involving children. How do we make it relevant?
I'm not saying on day 1 or day 4. I'm saying on day 14 or 2 months later.
Well, in a way, it is what Jeff said. It's longer, more focused pieces. And even though we have a half an hour show, I've noticed lately with Texas, with certainly Ukraine, significant stories, we don't follow the old model anymore. You've got a minute 50. Everyone else will only get a minute 30 because we're giving the really big stories more time because we want it to sink in. We want you to sit down and there's that old expression, by the time the journalists are tired of a story, the viewer's really only catching on. Whoa, look what's going on. And it could be 3 days old. So it is the writing, which is why it's so, for any students here, if you're not writing now, start writing and write, and keep writing, because it is what separates us from clickbait online. This is the virtue of traditional media, is we can give you more context, and it matters.
Can I just add, if you're talking also about the internal conversation,
there's a lot of swearing.
Yeah, there's some bad words, yeah. Time is tyrannical, right? Time is a real asshole, especially for a newscast, because when you have a nightly newscast, you get an extra hour, you're on an extra hour later, but you have to start out of the gate pretty early.
But you get a whole hour. You know what? Can we just shut this down and talk about
We're on at 5:30 Eastern every night.
Your deadline is brutal. But that means that the meetings are a lot of meetings. My God, there are a lot of meetings. But they're also pretty short. You got to get through a lot of stuff. So there has to be a way to punch through the normal routine and ritual of the meeting to go, I know we just blew by whatever, but stop. We need to talk about this. So you need people in that room
who are great debaters. If you've been a debater at school, whoo, we need you in the newsroom, like call me. But we need people who can make the case, who come to a meeting understanding what the connection is and why this needs to be on the newscast and can make that case forcefully. Because if you're gonna mouse your way through it, it's not getting on.
Yeah, I think the ritual and routine thing there is actually huge, because I think if your coverage of a story feels ritual and routine to you, like what are we going to do on Ukraine tonight, then it's going to feel that way to the audience, right? And I think it's just more time and energy rethinking what is a new innovative way we can do to tell the story and to keep it fresh. And there's not a silver bullet answer to that question ever, but that's what makes it so creatively challenging too, right? So I think it's a great question.
Part of that is, that's a great point, part of it is for covering Ukraine is the cycle of reporters, because every new reporter that goes in sees it for the first time, sees Bucha, sees Mariupol, like it's the first time they're seeing
And sees something different.
Sees something different, writes in a different way, talks to different people, and it just jumps again. So that's why I also think we've been very fortunate. Every reporter was clamoring to get there, because it is life-changing covering war. It's something you never lose, that desire to go back in. It's not the war, though. It's the humanity of it. I don't want people to think we're warmongers. It's the devastation and humanity of it, and how people are ultimately incredible survivors, and we're seeing that in spades right now.
Good journalists, and I look at Lisa and I think about your coverage in Afghanistan. Like, don't forget, for 16 years, Afghanistan was a top block story. Like, CBC had a permanent presence for 6 years. We are a couple months into this war, right? So we as a news organization, and I know you, and I know with Global as well, funding provided, because it's not cheap to send a crew into there. You've got insurance considerations, you've got security considerations. There's a lot to consider, but we have the DNA to be there.
And it's different, because it just made me think, when the war in Iraq started, we immediately opened a bureau in Baghdad. We partnered with ABC. We weren't with any military base. There were no Canadian troops, very few, on the ground. We opened a bureau there, and it was never empty, because it mattered geopolitically. On every level, it mattered. Interestingly, we don't have a bureau in Ukraine right now, and I don't know.
Not yet, maybe.
Maybe
right?
not yet. I know CNN just bought, 7 armored vehicles, 230.
As you do when you're CNN.
Well, I guess 230,000 euros. But yeah, it's true. They have big money, big budgets. But I don't know. It is different, for sure. It is, but not the way we cover it, if that makes sense.
But we're in an era where, like Osama Farag, who is a fantastic cameraman, and I, so this is how we did the National. Osama and I would, like two idiots with like our iPhone lights trying to figure out how to plug things in, would stand up there at 4 o'clock in the morning and get the National out and go, I can't believe we got away with that, right? It actually worked. You have the capacity. The technology is not a leash. There was a time in the era of Iraq and other conflicts where you could only go so far during a day as you could then get back at night to the satellite truck. It was like being on a leash, and then somebody leashed you to this pole in the yard and you just sort of can run around. You can't get beyond that leash's barrier. Now we can get beyond the barrier, and that's where time is tyrannical.
And
because then you have to file. Right?
And that's the thing, is the sort of the weird. It's much, there has been commentary about this, is the fact that the cellular network in Ukraine has held up. And I mean, we got high-speed internet no matter where we went, and that's so often the thing, right? Is like we can't go and especially you can't host a show from a place like that. But technically, it is there. I mean, we were getting 100 meg up from just about anywhere.
Right. And I just want to say one thing, because I did pool all of our reporters who, like Jeff, have spent so much time there. And some of the things people might not realize when it comes to light. So your curfew in Kyiv or whatever city you're covering, you've got to be inside. You are a target if you're not. Well, our deadlines, because of the time zone, it's really scary when you're on this side of it, knowing, all right, how far do they have to get? to do that on camera, is that on camera worth it, worth the risk? Taking a train from Lviv to Kyiv, you're in a train where they have to turn all the lights out in the train. Imagine that. Because if the lights are on in the train, everyone in it is a target. So there's all these little logistical things we don't even talk about on air. They're never part of the stories, how reporters get the story.
But this is so great with both of you hosts, because you've been working journalists, you've done reportage in the field, so you know to think of those things. Where maybe some, producer or boss hasn't just had as much experience as either all three of you have, which is like, and you're like, no, but yeah, they got to get on the road. Yeah, they might miss their deadline. They might have to file early. We take what we can get, because they're thinking at a different level and about different concerns. So that's what's so wonderful about having hosts with field experience and who are still going back in the field. It's not like you're out there, 10 years ago and now just sitting behind a desk. So I think that's super helpful to your teams.
I think Lisa and I would call ourselves the wing women for the people in the field. I think if I can do one thing at the show is to try to be the voice of someone who is too busy to be on the call, and I think it's important. I mean, we have a really wonderful desk. My dad used to be a TV director, and he used to say, "Rigidly flexible. There's one thing you need to be is rigidly flexible." And I thought, this is the most stupid pairing of words I've ever heard, but he was right, And I think we can sort of help to bring that notion that, you know what, we will make this work, they will make their deadline, we're gonna have to help them. And I think we've all worked with teams who are amazingly flexible at that.
And it is, like you said, logistics, and I always say this to journalism schools when I'm asked to talk, is they ask about foreign deployments, it's just like, not great math, but it is 90% logistics and 10% reporting.
Yeah.
As one of our colleagues put it, it's like doing reporting with a fire hose blasting in your face the whole time while standing on one leg. I mean, everything's going wrong. And in this case, this latest one, it was the gas shortage. So you can't get to the story without gas. You want to drive across the country, then we'd get gas. Then it turned out, we drive a kilometer, and it was bad gas. So we are stalling every 30 seconds, pulling over, and it's all that stuff where it really, really does help to have people who have your back in Canada.
I think there's a question. Yeah,
hi, my name is Zahir Hashimi. I work for City News 680. I just want a little bit more insight into the internal conversations that you guys mentioned before. So a part of my job, I speak to listeners a lot, and a lot of our viewers, and a lot of them, they ask us, they feel like international conflicts from their home countries don't receive the same attention and care that Ukraine is receiving now, and whether the conflict has happened before or is happening now, they feel like Ukraine got a little bit more attention. So I'm interested to see your perspectives on this. If you guys believe that dichotomy does exist, and if it does, how can we remedy that in the future and work towards a more balanced coverage for all international stories?
Okay, so let's just take on, because this is not new criticism or question, but the criticism that we're paying too much attention to Ukraine as compared to various conflicts, whether it be Yemen, Syria, even Afghanistan, though I think that might be in a separate boat. And that we like to cover Ukraine because their people resemble many Canadians more. So I think there's fairness in the question. So let me just put it to you, how you think about that, and what you say to that.
Nuclear would be the first word I would say, and I'm not trying to be funny. This is a conflict where the threat of nuclear escalation is very real. It was barely a week into the conflict. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning when there was a strike at Zaporizhia. So this is very real. Chernobyl, where Jeff was not that long ago. This has shifted geopolitics in a way we have never seen before. Really, I think we're talking 70 years since we've had these sorts of discussions. It has reanimated NATO. It has, in an interesting way, reanimated the global South as an alternate to NATO in some ways of thinking. I think the food shortages, the gas shortages, the threat to world hunger is different from what we have seen in other conflicts. I went to Mali. I know we've sent teams to Mali. That conflict's important. We sent teams to South Sudan. I mean, we could name again 16 years of Afghanistan largely every single day. I get the impulse
to think that Ukraine has had too much exposure, but I would push back and say, look at the potential implications of this conflict. I don't think in our lifetimes we've ever seen anything like it.
And I can't add anything to that. That's exactly right. I feel exactly the same way, and it's incumbent on us to, as I said before, just stay on this for those reasons.
And incumbent upon us, and I think we all do it, is to say to our bosses, but, we haven't been in Yemen, we can get into, and that story is still ongoing to get there, along with doing Ukraine.
I mean, it's not wrong. What they're saying is absolutely right. And it is crushing not to cover Yemen. It's crushing not to be in Bangladesh right now, or in Ethiopia during the conflict there, or Sri Lanka right now. We all want to go to all these places and tell these stories, and you do have to weigh up the direct impact on the Canadian life. And in this case, there are so many implications.
I think every reporter has a dream. I have a dream that if I ever, and if you ever hear that I've won like $100 million in a lottery, you just call me, because my dream is to start the Rogue News Network. And at the Rogue News Network...
I'm in.
Are you? Okay, good. We go to these places, right? Yemen is really hard to get to. Orla Guerin, who is a dear friend and one of the most incredible reporters I've ever encountered for BBC. Orla's attempts to get into Yemen have damn near had her killed repeatedly. It has been like smugglers and boats. It is incredibly dangerous and incredibly difficult and incredibly expensive. And we keep trying by reaching in there. We haven't been able to do it, and we feel the shame of that. We feel it like big time. It's important. And so then we have to say, what are other ways we can tell the story? But like Russia, we can't get in there right now. What are other ways we can tell the story? Do we work hard enough? I don't know that we do. I don't know that we do, but I also know that the fire hose of COVID, the United States, like everything comes at you every day, and I think people are kind of hanging on. Not a good enough reason not to do it, though.
I will just add, I think it's a very valid criticism, and in the sense that I think it's good for us to always be thinking about it. And I hope the people that are critical of all of our coverage on this keep reminding us to keep thinking about this, to keep pushing. I will just say, as the current affairs person here, I always say, we are a complement to the news. And so I work in radio. It's obviously really much easier for me to do a conversation on Yemen or Ethiopia, which we have done. But I value that criticism. And I think, valid criticism is not saying, well, I agree with you with your criticism. It's about cutting out the noise and the bullshit that we all get thrown our way. But a poignant piece of like, hey, have you thought about this, deserves not only a thought process, but an answer. And so I always encourage all my colleagues, if you can make the time, if someone writes, I always say we tell them to tweet us and we tell them to email us, and they do. And it's like the complaint letter that never gets responded to riles people up more because they think no one's listening. And it is our job to say we are listening and we are considering what you are saying, from the highest up to the lowest down and sideways in every which way. So it's not to defend it. I feel like they're good questions. Internally, we push each other. Externally, I think sometimes we're quick to dismiss, and even more so now with all the noise. And I think sometimes we just have to, what is it? I'm from Saskatchewan, I should know this. Wheat from the chaff thing. Separate the wheat from the chaff. I should know this. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. I do want to leave time for you, if anyone else has a question.
Hi, I'm Kate Otterbein. I am a student at Fanshawe College. Today, as a whole at this conference and also in general right now, there's a lot of talk about mental health, and I just want to see how you guys check in with yourselves after seeing something so traumatic and dealing with all of those feelings that come afterwards.
What?
Lisa, how are you, really?
I would say I don't know, we're probably the worst. I've never been good at it. I'll never forget after Hurricane Katrina, one of my male colleagues, and which was devastating to cover. I mean, literally, I'd just been there on holiday, and I go back, and there's bodies everywhere, or Haiti floods, and you turn the corner, and there's bodies everywhere, war, all of these things. You have this ability to sort of block it and go on to the next story. Or while I was literally always traveling, doing stories. And then this male colleague said, the company's you can go talk to a shrink. And so I thought, oh, wow, well, if he did it, maybe I'll do it. So I called, because I knew I was struggling. And it was a doctor on St. Clair, and I walked in, and I've actually told this story before because I do find it funny, but I walked in her office. I tried to say something. I literally did not stop crying for an hour. She had a box of Kleenex, then I walked out. She said, I really think you need to come back. I'm like, no, I'm good. And so it was just about crying. I don't know, and I'm a big crier. So maybe that's how, for me, it works its way through. Also, talking with my friends, my colleagues, we do share it a lot. Family's harder because you don't really, like they say, oh, how was it? You go, fine. It's too much. Or I feel like saying, well, did you watch? Because that's how it was. Pretty rotten, pretty awful, pretty devastating, But I don't know, everyone's got their own way. I know I am not a poster child for how to deal with PTSD or all of the things that we've lived through, except to just write it out,
Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. On our most recent trip here, we were talking about it just as the team that we were with. And it was interesting, right? It's, as Lisa alluded to, like everybody sort of digests these horrors differently. One member of our team was going home to see somebody. Another just thought it was all nonsense. And I was sort of somewhere in the middle. I think it is tough. And I think if you don't talk about it with people, it is usually his colleagues are the best people to talk to it about. And I mean, I have lots of wonderful colleagues who I can do that stuff with. And if you don't do that, I think it does become a problem. Like when I was still there, my wife this week called me. She's like, I'm really sorry to bug you, but like there's been this issue with our credit card and the company changed. We didn't know. Now we missed all these payments, and he's on the line. And when I was done, like just woke up from this rage that I had been, like I just lost it on the guy. I was like, and I don't know, it was just the first world problem thing that I just, yeah, it's first world problems when you come back from the third world are always difficult. But I used this analogy the other day. It's a pretty terrible one, but I'll say it again. I just think it's almost like, for me personally anyway, it's like wading into the ocean a little bit. And you're trying not to let the current pull you in, but you got to go in just enough to feel the temperature of the water and the sand on your toes, but you don't let yourself go to the point where the current can pull you in and you become immersed in it. So that's the challenge with these stories, is to allow yourself to feel it just enough, but then to you do have to keep a wall up there to a degree. Otherwise it can consume you, and it does, right? And I think, yes, it's definitely a challenge, and it's nice to have, the questions and the conversation about it happening in a way that, I haven't been doing this forever, but I don't remember having these conversations when I started my career, so.
Adrienne, you have 30 seconds.
Was that your segue to me? I've been doing this forever.
Yeah, so let's talk to someone who's in 52 seconds or less.
I can do it. Bring it home.
Come on, Arsenault, you got 49 now.
I got a wrap. You got 20. Go.
So I would say I'm worried about a couple of things. I'm worried about the hunger and the ambition of some of the young reporters who are like, put me in, coach. We are very good at sending people in. We're not so good at bringing them home. You go to HEAT courses, which is hostile environment training. It is crazy, but really important. We are getting better at this, is having the conversations after. But usually, there you go, smooth as butter. Usually what's happened is, you're finished a deployment, you're on your way home, you get an email, hey, listen, when are you back in the office? Because we're thinking we might do this. And it's just, you get two questions. How was it? And are you okay? To which you say, it was fine. Yeah, let's go. We got to get better at that.
Yeah, I will just say, I'm going to use up one more minute, a couple things. One is people are still scared a little bit to tell their bosses that, it was hard and it's not okay, we're getting better at that. Bosses are getting better and they need to get better because people are scared you're not going to get sent out again. So for all the bosses, please make sure you reassure your people when you come back that you're not asking as some kind of test that you pass or fail and that will determine whether we send you out again. It's a really important note. We are getting better. I will say I just went on HEAT a few weeks ago, which is the hostile environment training that we do. And I was with 5 people who'd covered the convoy in Ottawa. And so it was really eye-opening to me, and it's a reminder to all of us that we worry about the people we're sending overseas to deployments. Yes, war is hard, and it is comes with its own trauma, but more increasingly so is covering stories in our own backyard, whether climate change or a protest or, you know, a murder trial of someone accused of killing a child. And we have to remember that the domestic coverage and the stories we ask our people to tell have a deep impact, as well as the one that you guys have been involved in. I know you know all that. Yeah.
I just have to tell you how this is an example of how things have changed based on what you just said. In 2002, I went on the hostile training in England, and 2003, and 4 days in, and it's a 7-day course, my boss phoned me and said, "Go to Baghdad. You've got to go to Baghdad now." And I'm like, "But there's 3 days left." You know, and I always wondered, I'm never going to know what a translucent scorpion is going to look like and how to do a tourniquet and all those things. So now I don't think we'd ever do that now.
Yeah.
So we have changed.
Yeah. Thank you, you three, and especially because you just all got back. And I wish you some good rest before you get back on the air, probably today.
Well, the Jubilee was a lot of fun. It was really nice. It was exhausting, but in a great way. I mean, if a 96-year-old is good news, the Queen was.
Thanks, everyone.